Good morning or good afternoon, Xiaolong. I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm here to talk today once again to my dear old friend, even though we've never met in person.
It's the first time we see on video, right?
I think so. We've recorded some things on audio, and we've
Yeah, but not video. Yeah.
not video. And it's just amazing to me. I went back. We've been corresponding for a long time now. So
Mm, quite a long time
quite a
indeed.
long time and done things together, including the 100th anniversary edition of The Wasteland, which I remain very proud to have had your contribution to that.
Thank you. I love to do things, about poetry, about T.S. Eliot. So it's really honor for me to do that.
It's so this recording is focused on poetry and
Mm-hmm.
came about because I was thinking, I just found myself sitting by the pond this spring and thinking, what is the poetic impulse? Why do people write poetry? Why do people read poetry? In the past as well as in the present. And I thought, I know the person to ask about this because you not only write poetry yourself, you studied poetry, you translate poetry, and you even write about a character who is himself a
Oh, yeah.
poet. And then, of course, the Chinese and the English. And I was thinking, how so the poetic impulse, and then the difference between Chinese and English poetry, and how on earth you managed to think about that, let alone translate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say this first. To some extent, it is an impossible mission to translate poetry. And I can only touch on some aspects of the impossibilities here, okay? For example, a line in classical Chinese poem usually consists of 5 or 7 characters, right? 五绝, 七绝. But can we really convey the full meaning of the original in just 5 or 7 syllables, or what we call the feet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for another instance, a large classic Chinese poetry use just one rhyme or rhyming word throughout. But it's so different in English, right?
Well, we have patterns.
Yeah, we have like A, B, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, like the sonnet. You have really a number of patterns. So that is why, I'll say we have to know what we can do and what we cannot do in poetry translation, right? You cannot say, I just want to have one line, okay, consist of 7 feet or syllable. No, that's impossible. And it's also pointless because when you do so, you have to sacrifice the meaning, right? Of course, you can say, oh, I cut, okay, and the cut and to fit, right? But the translation read does not like a poem at all.
That sounds like that would be a very mechanical approach, wouldn't it? Almost a computer approach, telling the computer, you must do this, without context, without the sense of meaning or feeling.
Exactly. So one well-known Chinese scholar, and his name is Wang Zuoliang, and I really respect his work and respect him. He said something, right? The translation of poetry would better be done by a poet, because only the people who know the sensibility of a poetry language can you do that, right? Otherwise, well, in one sense, you can say poetry does not consist in what you want to tell. Poetry is more because of what is how you see it. You see it with the original linguistic sensibility, and then you convey it. Of course, it takes several steps, right? Convey it, yeah, in the target language. So even more ideally, I would say, it's better to be done by a bilingual poet and translator, because he can understand what really matters in the translation. But what's the problem with the translation we have read, especially the classic Chinese poetry into English? They are not done by scholars or poets, okay, who can understand the subtlety of both linguistic sensibilities.
Oh, it's a very specialized thing, I would think, to translate either way. But when did you begin? When did you first write a poem, and when did you first think of translating a poem?
Of course, you can guess, right? Yes.
Yes.
On my first attempt. Yeah. But I think I started translating T.S. Eliot in the 80s. Now it's more than 40 years, right?
Yeah.
More than 40 years. At least 30 more years. Okay, 30 more years.
Right.
I also have translated W.B. Yeats, several collections as well. And I also done a collection of poetry, Western poetry, called Imagist Poem.
Ah.
Yeah, so I have done a lot of things. And some poem, separate poems. So not too long ago, some people select some of my translation from English into Chinese into an anthology. So but it's sometimes it's fun. With your understanding of poetry change over the time, right?
Oh,
so now you reread it and you want to redo it. Yeah. But for the translation of classic Chinese poetry into
English, also done a lot of.
I also done a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe even more. It's kind of ironical, okay? Because with the government slogan to let Chinese literature go abroad, right? 让中国文学走出去.
Yes.
Then several universities, Chinese university, wants me to be, I think one wants me to be a title professor for the course about how to translate Chinese poetry into English, and I'm still giving a lecture series for the Wuhan University. It's also about how to translate.
Oh, how interesting.
And I am also talking, with a publisher about a collection of my Chinese poetry translation into English, us to publish the selection in the United States. So I've done something about the series, okay? And I also done a lot of practice myself.
Yes, and I so many times in reading your detective novels, Inspector will just say, I feel a poem. Just grab a piece of paper and a pen, and it's wonderful. It's you and I have corresponded about the fact that there are other poets. At least one other well-known poet who's a detective, famous P.D. James, famous detective, but there's no poetry.
There's no poetry in the novels, no.
Right, and I think there's one poem in all Dorothy Sayers' novels. Not that they were a poet, but there is a poem that's written, so she has dared to do that. But you do it all the time because it obviously wells up out of you and out of your character, who has the same impulse, and sometimes very controversial, but he's admired, obviously. But do you write those in English? Are you writing them at first in English or in Chinese?
No, you mean my own poems?
Well, or your own poems and Inspector Chen's poems.
Both. But nowadays, I do mainly in English first. English first. If I have some problems, if I don't think this really express my point, or it's not poetic enough, or again, my word, it does not contain enough of poetic sensibility in the poem. And then I can also do it in Chinese. The good thing about translation is like it kind of open you to the other possibilities. But it's like, because as I mentioned earlier, once you have the knowledge about the poetry translation, we can then try to approach the job, okay, in a more creative way. Poetry, to some extent, you have to be like, recreation. Otherwise, you may be loyal to the meaning, but the meaning in poetry is not that important, right? And you can be loyal to the versification, 7 character or 1 rhyming word, but that's not important. What makes poetry, to say it simply, is what makes it read like a poem in the target language. We all know, like, classical Chinese poems read so beautifully, right?
Yes.
You can feel the musicality, and you can feel the rhythm.
Even in English, I tend to, if I look at a classical Chinese poem, a short one, for example, they're very, with their books I have a book by my bed, or you quote in your books, you'll quote a short poem, a famous poem. And
Yes.
they tend, in English in the novels, and they're quite beautiful in English. I mean, are they more beautiful in Chinese?
Sometimes we can say we can try to be equal, but at the same time, it's different. Because in translation, you have to you have to do two things, or you can do it simultaneously if you can. One is foreground the original linguistic sensibility, okay? Because poetry is push the potential of one language to the extreme, like T.S. Eliot, right? Really push the language to the limit. Okay, that's one thing we have to do. But another thing we can do is to integrate. It's to integrate the Chinese and the English sensibility together in your translation, because your poem are going to be read by contemporary English readers or non-Chinese readers, right? So if the reader does not feel the sensibility, does not feel it's like a poem, no one will really want to read it. I think one of the problems with the Chinese translation does not going out of China so properly is because the translators, they do not understand, this kind of sensibility issues. Okay, they don't understand. Like for example, a well-known Chinese translator, his name is Xu Yuancong. He has translated many books. Okay, but it's so bad now. You cannot read it. So how can you expect, the Chinese literature go out of China successfully? No.
Because he's Chinese, he's translating into English?
He translates into English, but you cannot find his book in any English bookstore.
Right. Because it's very, very rare for someone to be able to translate into the language that is not their native language. See, you're actually truly bicultural. But
I think
that's unusual.
That sense, yeah.
Yeah. I've found this. Poetry is much more difficult, but I've dealt with a lot of publishers and authors who think that they can have someone Chinese translate into English. And the English, even if their English is competent in terms of China, it's not at all idiomatic. It's not, it doesn't work. It would be highly unusual, where, you're a different case because you obviously publish widely in English as well as other languages, and you've lived for many years in the United States as well. So that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I'm trying to, obviously I've only read Chinese poems in translation, and then I get so much poetry in a sense of a world in which poems seem to rise from the ground or something. They're in the ether to be captured. And that it so intrigues me that, where that happens and what the feeling is and what they do that's different from any other form of writing or art.
Yeah, again, I have to use the word poetic sensibility. you cannot grasp poetic sensibility like an object, right? No, it's something. I think I have to repeat what make poetry read like poetry, what make poetry appreciated as poetry. Now, that's something said easily, more easily than done, right? Than done. I can give maybe another example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in T.S. Eliot Cats, right?
Yes.
It's a free verse.
Yes.
It's free verse, but you do have the musicality.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
You do have
Definitely.
musicality. So that is why it's so successful.
Yes.
As a musical, right? As a musical.
Yes.
But this kind of inner musicality make things different. Or you can say inner rhythm, or you can say it's like I still like inner musicality better. Yeah. It's not something mechanical. It's not something like predictable. Oh, dang, 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 have to be like this. No.
Yes.
So that is why, we can do something in translation. If you not do this way, you can do that way, right? So in some way, one way or another, you can retain or present, the rhythm of the in translation. But they are different rhythm, of course, but they have the inner. It's not something like mechanical. Oh, I just have a 7 feet, right? No, it's not.
That you can mark off on a piece, on the paper. I saw the word cadence used in describing traditional Chinese poetry, which I hadn't seen that word used. That there's that in. And I hadn't thought about the rhyming in traditional Chinese poetry. So, there were rules, but then of course there was free verse too. And you more are of that tradition.
Yeah, because I realize it's not possible to translate by following the rhyming pattern or iambic pentameter,
Yes.
something like that. No, it's not possible. So that's why I choose a free verse.
Mm. Yes, that it's. I would have thought more flexible, especially when you're going back and forth. Yeah.
And also, I think, in free verse, we can try to at least present the meaning or the subtlety or the sensibility of poetry in a more comprehensive way. Okay, you don't have to delete this word in the original just because it's a character too more, right?
or grope madly for some synonym that's going to rhyme.
Right? Yeah. It's really awkward. What I mentioned Xuanzong's translation is just like that. He will, like, for the rhyming's sake, totally ignore the other parts of the job. So that's horrible.
Yeah. What about the revision? I one of the things I noticed in your novels, but also in the description of some of the books of poetry you've published, about this thing of revising. So there's an impulse to write a poem, to get something down. Something happens, some idea comes to mind. You get something down. So even in the if you then pick up something you wrote yesterday or last week and you're revising it, how is that different? Are you applying any sort of rules? Or are you thinking about the other language? What comes into that process?
Okay, that's a very good question. Maybe to begin with, I must have told you before, I started writing poetry, not fictions,
Yeah.
not inspection or Judge D, right? It's just poetry. Okay. So you can say it's in my blood.
At what age did you first start writing poetry?
It's during the Cultural Revolution. So it's, let me think, 13 or 14.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
14. Yeah, 13, 14. And another thing I want to mention it, because it's just funny, not only I have the character in my novels, okay, quote poems, right? In my two Judge D new book,
yes,
I also have a base in the plot on the base, also the investigation on the poetry, because in the Tang Dynasty, poetry is so important, and it takes a poet like Judge D.
Right, you have actual poets as the character. Yeah.
Get a clue and to solve the case.
Yes.
So it's kind of fun to me. And of course you can say it's a creative way, right?
But you're like really, really pushing poetry to people who might otherwise not think of poetry as something that would be engaging to them or that had any relevance now. I think that that's quite exciting and much more vividly than having Adam Daglish be a poet, but never actually, we don't know anything about what he writes, except it's no doubt very austere.
Austere, yeah.
Yes, and actually, I notice you have the Empress Wu in the novel that's coming out.
Yeah.
I'm excited about.
On the first Judge D book, Empress Wu's book, on the first one, I based on the poem written by Yu Shanji, the poetess.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As the clue, the breakthrough for Judge D to push the case. So, and I also have something like appendix, include all Yu's important poems.
Right. And how wonderful. We have a woman poet, we have literary romance, literary tragedy. It's really, it actually, that is one of the things that seems to me interesting. Is what can poetry convey? Why do people write poetry and read poetry? Why is it meaningful beyond other forms? People write poems about nature, they write poems about God, they write lots of poems about love and loss.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, TSL example, okay?
Yeah.
I think one thing he did purposely for his verse play is because he want to have more reader read poetry, right? Because he knows. Not many people read poetry nowadays. Yeah, but if people go see a play and maybe in this way, it's
kind of forget that it's poetry. Yeah.
So I got my, how you say that, I start writing Judge D or Inspection under his influence, right? It's a novel, yeah. But at the same time, I can smuggle in my poetry, and usually I translate in a way, especially for my novels. This poem appearing in my novels, in a way, not that academically, because I don't want to interrupt people's reading flow, right? So,
yeah. But you also use poetry, essentially dissident poetry, in some of the novels, don't you? The one that echoes Animal Farm, but also the pollution, the lake, Lake Tai.
Lake Tai, yeah.
Another case, yes.
Yeah. Poetry sometimes just flow out of you without your real understanding. Dissident or not, sometimes it's flow out like this. It's not like I purposely, try to focus on one theme, right? Mm-hmm. No, it's just flow out. Yeah, but it's also, you can say, like in China today, everything is politics.
Yeah.
You have to, get involved in one way or another. So I certainly will write more poems myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. In that direction. Yes.
Yeah. Well, what we'll do, I know you have a number of books of poetry, including one in which I believe you've published Inspector Chan's poetry as a book.
Yes.
So I'll put the links to those in, and I found that we have email. You've sent me some poems too from your translation, so I can have some examples. I really would like to encourage people to read some of the Chinese poems, and to think about. It's actually really interesting to think about how one might translate, the difficulty of translating, say, some of T.S. Eliot into any other language. That seems a remarkably interesting thing to take on. So well, thank you very much. It's so good to talk to you. I'm so excited about the new book. You've got the Judge D as a whole new endeavor. Which takes us back to early China. But again, you're finding lots of contemporary connections, aren't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Do you want me just to read one poem?
Sure, go ahead, please.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Okay, hold on. I take the book. The poem was written by Cui Hu. And the Chinese version read like this. 题都城南庄 去年今日此门中，人面桃花相映红。人面不知何处去，桃花依旧笑春风。Now I read the English version. Lines on the South Village. This door, this day, last year. You blushed, the blushing face of peach blossom reflecting yours. This door, this day, this year, where are you? The peach blossom still giggling at the spring breeze. Yeah. Well, at least some of the professors in China saying this one is not better than the original.
But very moving. And if it conveys, I take it that it's conveying it. There's feeling there. You said it has to be poetic.
Yeah, poetic, yeah.
And it certainly seems that to me. Thank you so much. I must get the text of that so I can include that with.
Yeah, I can send a text.
When I upload this, I'll do that soon. And maybe we'll talk again soon. Maybe when your new book comes out.
Okay, sure.
Great. Take care. Thank you. Thank you, Xiaolong.
You too.